Welcome back to the Fox Den, everyone, a podcast series from West Shore Community College. We are reviewing the winter 2025 book of the semester, Klara and the Sun, by Kazuo Ishiguro. This episode covers part 2, where we chat about the book's storyline with co-host and library director Patti Skinner, literary themes with Professor of English and Education Henne, and character development with Vice President of Academic and Student Services Kinney. I'm your co-host and Professor of Mathematics, Wade James. And now, part 2 of Klara and the Sun.
I'm Patti Skinner, and take it easy on me because I just got out of an awkward interaction meeting.
I'm Henne, and today I'll be impersonating Mr. McMain, the distant farmer.
I am Kinney, but Klara might know me as Silver Hair Man.
And I'm Wade James. I've hiked Morgan Falls, and it is amazing.
I want to dive right in. I always worry that the beginning of the book isn't going to have a lot of content, but that is not the case here. A lot happened in this second section. But I want to start us off talking about our humankind theme of overcoming loneliness and how this book relates to that. So in this part, we're introduced to Josie's loneliness. And that's the reason why Klara has entered their home. I think it's incredibly important to our discussion of this humankind theme to think about how this book relates to overcoming loneliness.
Klara makes a big deal out of loneliness being a driver for human interaction. You know, there's that moment when she's concerned or worried that Josie won't make a morning contact with Chrissy, and that if that ends up happening, then there'll be a danger of loneliness. Her algorithms or something in the way that she's constructed has made her deeply aware of loneliness being a driver of what happens with human beings. So Klara, at least, understands the world as being driven by this need to escape or get away from loneliness.
I think loneliness plays a big part for every character in this book so far. And so if you look at Klara, she has some obvious examples of where society has gone to a point where people are separated from one another. And even the scene in which she was going to go down for her interaction meeting, she was anxious and avoiding it almost because that social interaction, whereas most kids would be excited and rushing to meet their friends and I can't wait, what time are they getting here? Now this became something where she was stalling and brushing her hair. I think we see it even with the mom and some of the interactions that she has, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but there's certainly an element of loneliness that she is feeling there, or nostalgia or depression. And I thought it was interesting that we're even seeing signs of Klara herself feeling lonely. I think when they were at Morgan's Falls later in this section, Klara mentioned how it was nice to see other AFs out and about, which also hinted that maybe she's feeling a little bit lonely or nostalgia for the time when she had people of her kind around her.
I thought it was interesting. They're living in this home that is out in the country. The nearest house is fairly far away that you can't even see unless you're outside of the home. Not only are the characters experiencing the loneliness, but the houses are experiencing loneliness too.
So sticking with our theme of humankind overall, what does it mean to be human? The part that struck me in this section was when Klara wasn't in use, she would stand idly next to the refrigerator. And there was something really chilling about that for me because she felt so human and so real. To just discard her and have her be kind of inanimate felt weird to me.
That refrigerator thing is awesome because the suggestion is that she is one of the appliances. I think that's right, Patti. I think the first part of the chapter is a lot about Ishiguro challenging us to think about what it means to be human relentlessly. She does all kinds of amazing things that blew the top off my head. For example, she uses similes. She speaks metaphorically. She speaks in poetry, essentially. So there are several instances, especially early on in the chapter, where Ishiguro says, okay, you thought this was what it meant to be human. Guess what? The AF's doing that. And it piles up by the time you get to the end of it. And she's interpreting pregnant pauses and learning what they mean and how to express them. One of the most fascinating things is there's a conversation among the adults where they mention something about having to spend a good deal of an afternoon explaining to a child why she misinterpreted some of the social interaction stuff. Well, Klara seems to be getting it better than some of the human children.
I thought the same thing, Sean. I made a note to myself even that Klara seems to have more feelings, or at least awareness of her feelings, and certainly more social acuity than a lot of the other quote unquote humans in this book. So she has a very machine-like way of viewing the world, to be certain. But despite that, she is caring. She's often thinking about others in the way that she interacts, right? She'll often wait or try to decide when she should speak or when it's appropriate, when it's polite, versus just forging ahead with whatever comes into her mind. So whether it's being human or not, I feel like the humans are acting from a more reptilian part of their brain and just responding to whatever comes to mind, whereas Klara at least is cognizant of how others would interpret her statements. It made me wonder if Melania Housekeeper is an AF. Could she be artificial? And maybe that was part of the reason that she acted so coldly towards Klara when she first arrived, is here's a competitor. But I realized that even if she is human, she might still feel a little bit of that animosity towards here's another person coming in to do some of the job that I've been hired to do.
Every new character, I think, are they an AF? When I first read about Rick flying the birds, I thought, is Rick an AF because he lives with his mother and maybe his mother has a need for an AF? You sort of have to eventually just put a cap on and say, no, I think Klara's going to be the only one. And there's no hidden AF characters that are going to pop out as a surprise for us.
There's a reference to substitution. Josie's father lost his position in the chemical factory because he was substituted. So one imagines that what substituted for him was an artificial worker who got put into that space and could handle, high quality engineering just fine. So the idea that there might be other kinds of artificial entities in the world besides artificial friends is plausible, given some of the other things that happen in the book.
They never really describe what the AFs look like all that closely. When I first was imagining Klara, I had this, like light ring eyes, right? Very metallic looking. But there was one line where it mentioned her skin color. And that made me realize maybe an AF looks exactly like a human. And it would be very difficult for a human or an AF to tell which is which. Are we getting close to the Turing test? Is this a computer that can fool humans into believing that they're another human?
A physical Turing test. I think we're past the mental Turing test, but now we're getting into the physical Turing test. So can you physically tell if the entity is an AF? If you were a business trying to make artificial friends, you would want them to be as similar to the clients as possible. And you're right, there may be a whole host of artificial workers that do not look human, that are much more robotic, that have the same computer programming that Klara has, but their physical shape is more specialized for the job. Klara was specifically made to be a friend. So you want someone that is programmed a certain way, that looks a certain way, that humans will naturally bond to.
I guess I imagine that she looked just like a human girl, except I kind of pictured her as being like small, the perfect size for a child to befriend.
It's an Easter bunny. We all think we're talking about the same thing, but we have different mental conceptions of what that looks like.
And they all seem to look different. It's not like they pressed one AF and they all resemble one another.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see on your phone what voice most people have used. It would be a good social experiment to take all of the variations in dialect and accents and then just put them all out there and see which ones become the most popular. And then you would build AIs with that voice.
Okay, there are two big events that happen in this chapter. And the first is the interaction meeting. And there's a lot to discuss here. Any initial thoughts about the parents or the children that attend the interaction meeting?
In the field of literacy instruction, which is one of the places that I work in, there's a increasing emphasis on unsupervised play. In order for children to develop positive communication skills, they need to have interactions in which there aren't adults present. But even though they do that, it's still an artificial place, right? It's a set up environment. It's an artificial environment. So they aren't having unsupervised play. The adults are consciously eavesdropping, paying attention to what they're doing. The contemporary research we have in little ones learning how to communicate effectively is a lot about them being able to learn how to communicate effectively with each other without adults present. I had this experience in Ireland on my sabbatical where I was staying in a group of houses that were around a central open area. and the open areas where the children played. And during the week that I was there, it was Samhain. That's the Irish term for Halloween. And so it's a major holiday in Ireland, and the whole week they're off of school. The kids spent the entire day in this environment where they were charging around it's a pitch, basically. It's a soccer pitch, but they were doing all kinds of games, and they were in costume this whole time, which is fantastic. And so there's, princesses and goblins playing soccer in this pitch. There was a moment where one of the young lads hit the soccer ball, and it just pasted this other kid in the face. And it was a big deal. They had to sort out among each other, like, what would be the repercussion for this? If you did this, he hadn't been paying attention to what was going on, and he kicked this other kid. So what should they do about it? And I just happened to be sitting on the stoop, but I didn't intervene or anything. And the kids worked this out. But the level of communication that you need to have to be able to resolve that issue and come to a consensus about it, that's really practicing real communication that matters in the real world. One would imagine that the children in Klara and the Sun haven't had enough of that, and to the point where the Chrissy says to her daughter, the ones who haven't had enough interaction meetings won't be successful in college. You cannot be successful in the world if you haven't had enough meaningful social interaction.
Yeah, I started to get kind of Lord of the Fly vibes off of this, where the children are isolated among themselves, even though the parents are eavesdropping. And immediately you start having the three boys that are kind of the bullies, the group of girls that are courting Rick as he comes in. They offer him chocolate. They're talking to him. They're trying to get to know him. And so you see this gradual escalation. You start establishing these groups that naturally occur without adult supervision.
What about Rick stood out that they knew immediately he was an outsider?
They relentlessly pronoun it, right? There's definitely a we group, and the we group is not the you when we're talking to Rick. So Rick becomes a you is distinct from the we that they are. So they mark him with their pronouns.
Well, and the fact that they referenced their social interaction scores at one point tells me that this group at least is being graded on how well they're socially interacting based on some objective standard that somebody somewhere has set.
Klara may have access to those scores because we don't know why she perceives those three boys as having a poisonous, sickly yellowness to them. So there's a flag for her that maybe would be designed to help her protect Josie from them. Something has given her that clue, and it might be because she's reading a score like that.
Do you think that Wade is right, that every situation would devolve here into the Lord of the Flies territory? Is this inevitable?
They're protecting their own tribe, right? The more relentlessly you dehumanize people who don't belong to your tribe, the more secure you feel in yours. The ferocious dehumanizing of Klara is paralleled with what they do with Rick.
And in those interactions, you see Josie responding negatively to both of them. That's the first time that you've seen an alternate way of Klara being addressed by Josie. And sort of the same thing happened with Rick.
Yeah, Josie shows another side of herself to Klara. That's really kind of surprising to Klara and upsetting for their close relationship that she thought they had. But what really changed their relationship, where she said their feelings were not as warm towards one another, was the trip to Morgan's Falls.
When this scene first presented itself, there was a slight bit of foreshadowing and saying this was the moment that created some rift between Klara and Josie. And I expected that it was going to be some sort of an argument or a fight between the two, or something that happened between them. But in fact, what happened was they didn't go together. That was the entire thing, is that Klara got to go and Josie didn't get to go. Here's another example where, through no fault of Klara, Josie was probably made to feel lonely and having to stay back. And that was enough to create this rift between the two of them.
The blame that should go to the mother is getting passed along to Klara, because the mother orchestrated this whole thing. And that's what made me feel the ickiest reading it, is how manipulative the mother was behaving by blaming Josie for still being sick.
Ishiguro set that up for you, Patti, really well. It comes from the video game conversation. Josie has a predilection for these video games in which she's trying to save people from crashing in a crash. As Klara listens to that, she comes to understand subtext. Beneath the current of the conversation about video games, it's not really about video games. And she recognizes that. She doesn't know quite how to process what's going on at the falls, which is why she's got 97 boxes of the mother's face. When she doesn't know how things are working and she's trying to put it together, the number of boxes that she sees in her visual perception explode. And she gets 3 different versions of the mother's eyes because she doesn't really know how to read them. So she knows that there's something going on there. Because she's learned by figuring out how subtexts work. Neither she nor we, as the readers, know exactly what's going down.
She also, at one point, says that she recognizes that people say things in certain contexts, and when they're around other people, that you should ignore or not think too much about later on, which I think, again, that's bigger than most human beings are, and being able to not hold grudges and put it behind you. Klara seems already to recognize we have to behave differently sometimes in front of other people, but that's probably not how Josie truly feels about me.
That comes into play both in the interaction meeting and with the falls.
It's intriguing to me that she had that visceral reaction Klara did to seeing the bull in the field, and later contrasted it with the sheep. What aspect of her programming caused her to have that reaction, or is it because that she'd had so many different kinds of observational experiences that the bull stood out as terrifyingly different in that particular moment?
I thought it was interesting that she associated it with being in the ground, that it was a creature from the depths. Just, I don't know if it was based off of the bull's appearance or she interprets different physical aspects just as she was doing with the mother's eyes. So was she reading physical traits of the bull and associating those with what would be negative traits if they were exhibited by humans? I thought it was interesting too that she thought maybe afterwards it went back into the ground.
That's the point that was most fascinating to me too, Mark, because there are mythological overtones in many places in the book as Klara makes her myth about the sun, for example, which echoes Egyptian and Greek myths about the sun returning to the earth, that kind of stuff. But there's a Daedalus, Icarus, Minoan thing going on with that bull that intrigues me. She calls it a creature of mud and darkness. And Daedalus was directly responsible for the bull being in the labyrinth, Daedalus being this master craftsman, capable of creating all kinds of amazing things, including the labyrinth. But the Daedalus Icarus story is what happens if you get too close to the sun, right? And so warnings about what will eventually happen with the myth-making capacity that Klara develops.
I guess I thought more about if you had never seen a bull, it never came up in one of the magazines that were available at the store, maybe it would seem scary and otherworldly.
It'll be fascinating to see how many times Klara is capable of leading humans astray, where she makes a misinterpretation or misunderstanding about something, and then blindly other people follow her. And what I'm concerned about is the miscalculation she makes. She's got this amazing ability to observe, but then when you have to draw conclusions based on your observations, and if she makes a miscalculation about either a human experience or a misunderstanding about the physical world, then is she capable of getting humans to misunderstand or misbelieve?
Is this what makes us human, our ability to make meaning?
I think Klara is showing plenty of capacity to make meaning of things, and she's probably making just as many misinterpretations and missteps as the humans in the book.
You've been listening to The Fox Den, a podcast series from West Shore Community College. This has been our discussion of the Winter 2025 book of the semester, Klara and the Sun, by Kazuo Ishiguro.
Thank you so much for joining us. That's our podcast. I'm Patti Skinner.
I'm Mark Kinney.
I'm Sean Henne.
And I'm Wade James.
Did you predict that Mary Poppins would come up as part of our podcast?
Was not on my bingo card.
Are we winding down here, guys?